Hello, and welcome back to the Think Education podcast. One of the ones where everything looks perfectly normal on the surface, and underneath we've all been scrabbling with tech and diaries and everything. But it's great to be back. I'm Chris Hill, joined as ever by Judith Lammy, and we're joined today by is it third time guest? I think I'm going to say whether it's true or not. I'm going to say third time guest and multiple contributor to books, right? So almost adjunct podcast host, Vicky Lewis. It's a delight to have you back with us, Vicky. Thank you very much for making the time, because clearly in your world there are a few things going on in terms of international higher education and the stuff that you're working on. So it's a pleasure to have you back, and we'll have some more sort of ongoing conversation about trying to put the world to rights. So I'll hand over to Judith to kick us off. But yeah, here we are. Here we go again.
Thanks very much, Chris. And it's lovely again to see Vicky. Now, usually at this point, I do a little introduction, and I could do that about Vicky. You know, for 13 years, I've noticed on your LinkedIn that you've been a consultant, Vicky. I don't know whether you've got to go and stroke a black cat or not walk under a ladder or something.
I probably should.
But you just do all of those things, you know, just to make sure. And of course, you were at Bournemouth University for quite a number of years, as well as Edinburgh Napier and various others. But let's be honest. Anybody listening to this podcast is going to know Vicky Lewis. So we are here with Vicky Lewis, and it's just wonderful to see you again, Vicky. And at what I mean, every time's an interesting time, isn't it? Really, within international higher education, but particularly, I would say again, this particular time. And I know we've talked to you about various things before, Vicky, and as Chris has said, you've also contributed to the books. We did warn you a few years ago that once we know you, you can't escape, and this is just proving the point. But it would be really great, Vicky, maybe just to start off by getting a few of your reflections, maybe on in particular, I suppose, if we think in the broadest sort of capacity about international strategies, international education strategies. Obviously, we've had relatively recently the new one through the UK government, but obviously then a lot of universities will have been reshaping and changing theirs as well, one would imagine. But it would be just great to hear a little bit maybe from you about how you think international education strategies have changed in the last few years.
Thank you, and thank you so much for inviting me back, Chris and Judith. It's lovely to be with you again. Right, yes, international strategies. I mean, I do think that certainly in the UK over the last few years, there's really been a kind of unresolved tension highlighted around sort of internationalist values on the one hand and financial reality on the other. And I mean, you may remember that during the pandemic, I looked at university strategies through the lens of global engagement and priorities, and kind of came to the conclusion that there was a bit of a kind of disconnect between the rhetoric in the strategy documents, which was all sort of noble words about making a global contribution, and then the success measures, the KPIs, which tended to be around recruitment of international students, rankings, income generation, that kind of thing. And I think during the pandemic, there was a sense that because there wasn't mobility, we were kind of getting back to some of the basics, some of the more kind of fundamental philosophical questions about why do we engage globally, and thinking about social impact, internationalization at home, and so on. But since then, we seem to have sort of launched ourselves back into focusing on international student recruitment for many very kind of coherent, cogent reasons. Last year, I thought I'd have a look to see what had changed in terms of the success measures that institutions use when evaluating their success internationally. To see, if anything had changed since I last looked at them during the pandemic. And the quick answer is not really. At that institutional level, the only clear shift was there were more KPIs around things like environmental sustainability. But the distribution of international KPIs was broadly similar to the sort of ones I looked at in 2020, 2021, with the most frequently occurring one being number or proportion of international students on campus in the UK, and rankings position. So that kind of reset that appeared to be possibly on the cards during the pandemic really didn't happen at the institutional level. All the focus was on recruitment when it started to sort of rebound after the pandemic. And, that was for a number of reasons. There was sort of obviously pent up demand, but also the reintroduction of the post-study work visa in the UK. And the fact that institutions were in fairly dire financial straits and international student tuition fee income was the only lever available to them to try to balance the books, so to speak. But I then thought it might be interesting to look at the level below those institutional strategies. Obviously from the institutional strategies cascade specific global engagement or internationalisation strategies. And my sense was they would probably have a more nuanced reflection of what international success looks like. So with the caveat that a lot of those international strategies for institutions aren't published and aren't publicly available. So it was a pretty small sample. I was able to kind of compare what they looked like in 2025 versus 2020, 2021. So 4 years on. And what I noticed there was, there was a rise in the number of KPIs and the focus on TNE students programs, partnerships. And in fact, that kind of marginally outnumbered the number of KPIs relating to recruitment of students to the UK, which it was this kind of nice little reflection of what was actually happening in terms of the national data, where I think this year, for the first time, the numbers of UK students on TNE programs, sorry, not UK students, students on UK TNE programs, overtook the number of international students coming to the UK. So that seemed to be being reflected in the focus at that international strategy level. And there was also a bit more focus on things like promoting international and intercultural experiences, things like outward mobility, internationalisation at home. So that's sort of what's been going on in terms of institutional strategies.
Just on that note, Vicky, it's almost like there's so many questions. I've sort of having to stop myself from interrupting you and saying things like, sorry to interrupt your flow. I'm glad you paused then. Because one of the many things that's just jogging around my head at the moment is do you think in one respect, one reason why some of those changes have taken place in terms of the measures, this is a bit of kind of thing you probably couldn't say if you were at an institution, is because if universities are stuck with the old measures, i.e. how many international students are they getting, yada, 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 they would have all been in the red because those numbers are all going down. We know they are, except for, I imagine, a very few institutions, but by and large, they're going down. So unless you really want to get in trouble with your councils because everything's, going in a southerly direction, or you have to change the measure for the KPI, which I don't think many would probably think of doing. Let's say that they had set it at, just pick a number out, let's say they set it at 1,000. Are they going to go back to the council and say, well, there's issues, so shall we set it at 500 now? So do you think in one way, they're flipping to the TNE partnerships, internationalisation at home, internationalisation of the curriculum measures, because at least these are ones that they can show some growth in?
It's a really difficult one. It's very complex. And I think the again, I mean, I think the institutional strategies seem to be slower to pick up these changes than the more nuanced internationalisation strategies or global engagement strategies. So I looked at institutional strategies that were published in the last few months, and it surprisingly to me, TNE is not mentioned at all in explicitly. It's all couched in terms of partnerships and equitable partnerships and collaborations and so on. It's sort of softer terms. And TNE is definitely not showing up in that. Most institutional strategies have a section on financial sustainability, don't they? And there's no mention explicitly of TNE as the sort of savior of the institutional finances. And I think, if you think about the UK's new government international education strategy, where there's very much been a kind of flip towards TNE, it's very central focus of it. I do worry that a lot of sort of hope is being pinned on TNE as a way to meet that £40 billion education export target by 2030, when in reality, as we all know, TNE is a long burn and it's not a money spinner. And
so in a sense, what seems to be coming then also out of what you're saying, Vicky, is that the institutions aren't even taking a short amount of time to step back, potentially anyway, and revisit their international strategy, embed TNE as part of it. They're almost seeing it appears, some of them, as a tactical action to deal with the challenges in their current strategy. And as we all know, it's not that TNE won't and doesn't, isn't financially sustainable and viable. It is, but it does take time, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right about there being a sort of tactical response going on that maybe, isn't always reflect. I mean, obviously there's a time lag with strategy documents anyway, because, they take, a while to pull together, and then they tend to sort of stay there. Things like the pandemic did cause institutions to have kind of refresh their strategies, but other than that, mostly they stay until the 5-year period or the 10-year period is up, or a new vice chancellor comes along and wants to tear it up and start again. But I think I can completely understand the tactical response, and particularly with the government having made it so evident that the constraints on recruiting international students to the UK are going to continue and are, if anything, going to get even tighter. So, of course, the focus is on TNE, but I think there's something in what you said about the need to step back a little bit. And I mean, I'm not saying institutions have rushed into it, but I think there are some if you take India, for example, with the opportunity to set up branch campuses there, which many UK institutions are taking advantage of. And some of them will have experience of having set up branch campuses elsewhere and may well be going into it with their eyes more open. Some may not. And I mean, I would love to have a crystal ball, look forward 10 years and see which ones are still in existence in 10 years' time, because I would, lay money on it being not all of them.
I would think that's absolutely right. Yes. I think you might get an odds-on value there, or evens at best. Yes, and I suppose. I mean, I don't even think you'd have to wait 10 years, Vicky, probably a couple of years, and let's see the ones who have put in for applications, see if any of those have actually started and students have come through the door. There seems a naivety, doesn't there, with some, in that there's lots of potential students out there, so all we have to do is, build something and they'll come.
Well, you would really hope that we've moved on from the kind of drag and drop style of TNE, where it's sort of like, well, we'll just sort of, plonk down what we do in the UK. And you know, I hope that, you know, lessons have been learned about, you know, localization and contextualization and so on, and really embedding institutions and partnerships within the kind of local higher education and industry and employer infrastructure. But, you know, it's easier said than done, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it's the same. Sorry, no, I'll jump in a second. But yeah, I think that's exactly it, isn't it? You know, it's often, I think if you look at and read around all of the things that are taking place in India at the moment and all of that kind of material and all of everything that's available, you can see that is definitely there in a lot of those institutions. But as you say, sometimes it's easier to say that, but actually to do it is another matter, isn't it, really? Chris, I think you were trying to...
No, I mean, I completely agree. And I think that I likewise echo the hope that it's, you know, being entered into, you know, it's properly. But realistically, when we're talking about reflecting on the points you're making, Vicky, about this tactical activity, you can't not go to India. Not when you've got the pressures that you've got at home, balanced with the potential to not at least try would be probably short-sighted. To not try properly is going to be less sustainable. But I think it's interesting because, and this I think might lead us to, you know, another question we have for you, which is, I mean, we've had these conversations before, I think, between the three of us, that T&E strategies were becoming kind of more independent and more identified rather than kind of a hidden bit within internationalization, because T&E was such a relevant issue, particularly for, not uniquely, but particularly for UK universities. And it makes sense that it's now becoming oh, well, this is the focus, because if you don't look over to my left, because that bit's on fire, let's look over to the right and let's hope that. So, I mean, it makes sense, but I was curious, you know, because you were talking about success, and in one of our previous sessions, we talked with Gossia about success and how that gets measured for different people within the kind of ecosystem within which we work. And I know you've done a lot of work and you've had a lot of attention placed at, you know, students at the heart of the internationalization strategy. And I'm also wondering not just what, you know, that means in your view, but how are students placed at the heart of a transnational education strategy? Because they are removed, right? At least with an internationalization strategy, particularly if it's about recruitment, you can say they are physically real, as opposed to a number on a spreadsheet if they're abroad. And student experience in T&E has, you know, historically been something we've had less understanding of, perhaps. I know that is evolving. So yeah, I'm you know, interested in your reflections on, are we doing it? Are we doing it well? Are we nowhere close?
No, that's a really interesting question, and I think I'm acutely conscious that T&E students and their experience is often, you know, at best an afterthought in strategy conversations. So, I mean, just a little bit of sort of context as to sort of what I've been working on and why. It's for I've done a book chapter for Elspeth Jones and Ravi Amagan's latest Routledge publication, which is due out at the end of the year, on student-centered internationalization. They asked me, as the strategy nerd that I am, to do the chapter on student-centered internationalization strategy.
So, Judith, we can't get too offended that Vicky writes for other people.
No.
Like, you know, she is independent. She is her own woman. We can't get too offended.
I'm moving on. It's watching over me.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, glossing over that bit. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So, and what I really wanted to do was be challenged out of my Anglo-Western mindset and seek the perspectives and experiences of experts from around the world to sort of feed into that chapter. Which was fascinating. You know, sort of sent out a draft chapter with some survey questions and got input from, I think, it's 23 people from 6 different continents, all sorts of different types of institution, different roles, but all you know, practitioners or researcher practitioners in the area of international education. And I think it made me realize, context is very important when it comes to how you place students at the heart of internationalisation strategy, and some contexts make this easier than others. So, for example, a respondent from Mexico talked about the fact that Latin American universities are guided by the sort of philosophy of or the educational philosophy of humanism, which obviously really aligns well with placing students at the centre. Whereas in the UK, it's a bit harder work because there's a much more kind of commercial focus to our national kind of strategy and our national discourse. But what struck me was that it's often about flipping perspective or flipping the emphasis. And there were three areas that I thought really stood out as needing new perspectives, new emphasis. And one was, and it sort of links to what we talked about before, it's sort of not flipping the emphasis from institutional prestige and performance to student development and success. So not asking, how many partnerships do we have, how are we doing in the rankings, but looking at student outcomes, with that's employability, career readiness, global outlook, and measuring success in terms of their development and outcomes that are aligned with their interests and their needs and so on. The second flip was from focusing strategies on the mobile minority to focusing strategies on the whole student body. So certainly in the UK, we have this tendency for the vast majority of our strategies to be kind of devoted to the relatively small proportion of students who can actually travel, whether that's international students coming to the UK or the tiny number of UK students or UK-based students who have outward mobility experiences. Whereas a student-centred approach focuses on everyone, whether UK students, TNE students, home students, international students, the ones who are mobile, the ones who stay put. And as such, internationalisation at home becomes a clear strategic pathway. And you've got intercultural dimensions embedded across teaching, learning, student support, campus life. There's real cross-institutional engagement beyond international office teams because it's embedded in learning and teaching strategy, for example, or research strategy. And there's a recognition of diverse student realities that they, have. Each student has different motivations, experiences, needs, interests, and it's not helpful to kind of use blunt, homogenized segments of like home students, international students, UK-based students, TNE students, because there's going to be a mix of motivations and backgrounds and contexts for all of them. And then the other flip, the sort of emphasis flip, was around students moving from thinking of students as sort of beneficiaries of the strategy to students as co-creators. And that's possibly the most important one in a truly student-centered strategy. I was interested to see the IAU International Association of Universities did a global survey in 2024, and they found that globally under half of institutions involve students in shaping their internationalisation strategies and policies. And this was an area where the respondents to my little survey felt their institutions could do better. And I think there was a sort of strong view that students should be helping to shape strategy, not just sort of receiving its outputs. And I think there are some huge benefits from involving them in shaping strategy from the outset in terms of sort of introducing a culture of seeking and acting on feedback, building engagement, and sort of sowing the seeds for them to become ambassadors for the institution once they graduate. So there are all sorts of good reasons for involving them early. But I think UK universities particularly are really bad at reflecting on the success or otherwise of a previous strategy before they launch into designing the next one. Really, there should be an exercise that says, okay, what did we do well last time? What didn't work out as we planned? What lessons have we learned, and how are we going to feed that into the next strategy? And I think that it maybe happens in a minority of cases, but it's fairly superficial. And I think it's even less likely that we would ask students to help evaluate a strategy against degree criteria. But why not?
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, and that's an interesting point then, isn't it? Very often we're all saying that students are at the heart of everything we do, the institutional strategies, etc. But we don't always put them at the heart of these, do we, very much? And that includes the sort of creation. I think the notion of sort of co-creation when it comes to curricula, etc., has been something that has been part of or embedded in institutions when it comes to their learning and teaching strategy for some time, hasn't it? But I suppose our international strategy, if you think about it, in some ways, it's, if you are aligning it with any other institutional strategy, it's very often been the research strategy, because you've looked at it in terms of the partnerships and the research impact side, hasn't it? There's probably been less in terms of that dovetailing with the learning and teaching strategy, unless you're talking about delivery of programs overseas, and unless you're talking about sort of things associated with collaborative partnerships and almost the quality issue side of it. So this is really looking at it, isn't it, from a student perspective side, a student success side, more than any other part.
And I think even where the driver is something quite different, there is still a sort of student angle on it, where students can be centred. So, for example, one of the survey respondents from Tunisia said, well, the driver for our institution is about international, sort of building up international standards, and improving our rankings position. But one of the ways this cascaded into practice was, for example, having the final project or final year of master's students and PhD students having co-supervision with supervisor, so between a supervisor from the Tunisian institution and a supervisor from an EU partner institution, with the idea that this would enrich the academic experience of the students and at the same time build that international kind of authority and benchmarking and help them move up the rankings. So it wasn't entirely coming at it from the student angle, but there was still a student benefit to the way they approached it.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, does it? Far from it. Can be something. Can I take us just in a slightly different direction? Because there's a couple of other things I think I quite like us to touch upon, in the last 15 or 20 minutes. One of them is around equitable partnerships, which you mentioned previously. And the other is, maybe if we have the time, just to touch upon leadership within all of this. You mentioned when you were talking at the beginning about, the changes in international education strategies, about equitable partnerships in particular, you said that phrase. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that. What do you think of when you think of equitable partnerships? What does that mean to you, and what do you think could be the benefits for universities as we go into the next stage, embedding these in the strategies and plans that they have?
Well, I suppose it's, what it's moving away from the old approach, which was, potentially extractive and, colonialist and imposing our Western approaches and our Western assumptions on partners. And I think there's another angle which is about so it's recognizing that we are equal partners in the sense that we each bring experience to the partnership, and it's about exploring how that can be dovetailed and complement each other. And there's another angle around sort of equitable split of resources and responsibilities, so that it's not, so we're moving away from assumptions that there's going to be a sort of Western lead partner, that, you know, and I know that, you know, there's been some really good work done by Charles Cormack Consultancy Group, looking at models for sort of investing in development funds that partners can kind of tap into through the course of a partnership, and to try to make sure that the focus is on kind of continuous upgrading, learning, capacity building, and so on. But yes, I mean, I suppose that's what comes to mind.
So yeah, because I think that's just a really interesting sort of addition, I think, to what you said previously in terms of TNE, in terms of international strategy. You can almost see that as been a bit of a bridge, can't you? Because if you have those kind of partnerships, one would therefore imagine the next step also would be that all of the things that you talked about in terms of the importance of context, the student perspective, all of those start to become embedded in it, don't they? Because all of it's vital to what you're doing. You know, be you the partner that's delivering some of the curriculum sort of remotely, or you're the partner in country, you know, so that it seems to be something where we're taking a more mature and holistic view of partnerships.
Yes, and I think there's something about investing in particular countries or regions or localities, and showing that, you know, you're sort of in it for a long-term relationship.
Yeah.
And it's not, I mean, in the past, I think, you know, it was much more transactional sometimes. Some of the TNE partnerships were quite transactional. And, you know, in a way, sort of that was of its era, and it served a purpose. And many of the institutions, I'm thinking in Malaysia, for example, with whom UK institutions partnered, say in the 1990s, have, you know, moved on and become established parts of the local higher education infrastructure ecosystem. And you know, the partnership was valuable to them at that time, it was valuable to the UK university at that time, but things have evolved. But I think that now we're going into it with a slightly different mentality, and there's a very different perspective in partner countries. You know, that they don't want those transactional relationships, and you know, it's not. I don't think it's helpful for either party to go into these things with a short-term kind of instrumentalist kind of view.
Which actually, I think it sort of paradoxically helps both sides, as you say, because it forces you to not be transactional, because that's not what's required. And the shift of balance means that the host nation is saying, as you say, well, we don't want that, we want specific, etc. Which also means that the matchup is greater, because then you're saying we're not going just because we think there's a market to get students in the abstract. It's because we think there's a market for students in this particular degree, which aligns to our strengths, which aligns to your strategic priorities, which aligns to potential funding mechanisms, which in turn leads to, one would hope, more equitable and more sustainable partnership. So, you know, that's what, to bring it back to the previous conversation about India, that's what you would hope is ongoing. It's not just, oh, let's go and try to access the billion plus, you know, population. Let's go to this pocket, to this pocket, to this pocket, where which is something, you know, where I work in Dubai, that's been a specific strategic priority. It's no, we're looking for partners in A, B, and C.
Yeah.
Can you align to that? And if so, we can sort of build something, which in turn, I suppose, raises the value of the student. You know, they become less a number, and because they are linked to employability, they are linked to ambassadorship, they are linked to all these things that you're bringing. So we've kind of stumbled into the positive evolution of where we want to go. Yeah.
And I think, I mean, there's going to be so much there's already so much more sort of complexity in the types of relationships across different regions. So, a lot of South-South partnerships and, institutions from the global South setting up campuses in the global North, and it's just much more multipolar, isn't it, than it ever used to be, and
absolutely.
all these differences in drivers and motivations and perspectives make it more important than ever, I think, to challenge our assumptions as sort of Anglo-Western institutions.
On that note, Vicky, I wonder whether, on the sort of almost the final topic within this, we could talk a little bit about leadership within this and what this might mean for our leaders within these contexts. Our leaders, be they looking at the development of strategies, looking at the development of partnerships, looking at bringing students more into the heart of everything that we're doing. I mean, how do you see this as potentially affecting, how leadership is going to be developing?
And it's a really, really interesting question. And I did a little sort of temperature check in March of this year, looking at the job ads on jobs.ac.uk for international positions, to see what that told us about the direction of travel for international education. And one of the things that came out of that was it was a tiny little snapshot, but there was a role, a vice principal role, which was global engagement and partnerships. And I think we're seeing many more senior executive level roles that combine global and partnerships. I've also seen one recently that is global and regional engagement. And I think that's a really interesting combination because a lot of the discourse in the UK is about the role that UK institutions can play within their regions as anchor institutions, as big employers, as sources of graduates who would go into the employment market, as with their connections, their international connections, maybe inward investment, attracting inward investment. There are all sorts of ways that universities can contribute to their local communities, which is what is super important politically at the moment. And joining that up with in a single role with someone who also has responsibility for global engagement, I think is incredibly powerful, because it brings those two agendas together and you've got somebody who's across both of them. So I think there will be a sort of evolution of the types of role that we'll see at executive team level to reflect some of the emerging priorities for institutions. And I do still think it makes such a difference having a role with a global dimension to it at that level. I mean, I've worked with universities where that hasn't existed, and what tends to happen there is that international activity is very fragmented across the institution, and there's a lot of inefficiency because people are doing things in their silos and it's not joined up.
Inefficiency, universities, what?
Shock.
What?
You heard it here first, guys. Yes, I suppose it's interesting, isn't it, Vicky? Because if you think like 20 years ago, the word global and international could only really be found, in the recruitment teams, couldn't it? Then there was a gradual ramping up of it, and then it seemed to be everywhere. And now it seemed to be starting, particularly when we had the challenges here a couple of years ago, to be disappearing again.
Yeah.
And now it seems to be resurfacing. It's like a curve, isn't it?
It's
surfacing, but in a different way, in a way in which it's fully embedded I suppose within those areas I mean, how many of us haven't said over the years that you can do internationalisation and you can be an international university and a university of your community and of your place at the same time? They're not mutually exclusive, but actually having roles there that are there to do that, I suppose, is something that might help accelerate what people have been trying to do.
Yeah, and I think it tells you something about the focus and the distinctiveness of each university, exactly how they package those roles. So, I mean, another example I can think of is where they have combined global engagement and careers and employability in a executive level role. And again, that's absolutely fascinating, because it means that institution it is absolutely focused on careers and employability, but it's not just for domestic students. It's global employability, and it's employability for international students in their home countries.
I suppose one, just this would be a bit provocative, but it shouldn't really be with only a few minutes to go. You can create these senior roles, can't you? Or you can create these roles, but in the meantime, everything else is going along as it has gone on for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years for some people. So there's a challenging job of work to do, isn't there, for those people who are in those sorts of a role, to bring the institution and those individuals, be they on the professional service side or on the academic side, along with them. Because it may mean reshaping and refocusing what they're doing, and at a time when maybe you're doing a lot more anyway, they would need to see the reason behind that, wouldn't they?
Yes, I mean, I think it is challenging, and I think part of it is also sort of educating their peers on executive boards, that because I think everybody's got their own remit and responsibilities, portfolio, and their own perspectives, and sometimes it is about really sort of stepping back and making the effort to educate one another about one's own portfolio, and how and really spending time looking at where the connections are across the different portfolios.
So that probably, and I'll hand back over to Chris in a moment, because I know we're going to have to sort of round this off, but that probably then also goes back to the individuals and the personalities within those types of boards, doesn't it? And maybe the essential qualities that those people need in order to help not only drive forward what they have on their own agendas and within their own portfolio, but to be strongly aware of others and how they dovetail and the need to work together. And therefore you need a team, don't you, that are very much aligned to working in a matrix fashion, but also just to be aware of what others are doing and see this as not something that's just a nice thing to do, by the way, but actually something that is fundamentally important if you want to achieve what you want to achieve for the university and for the students, or rather the other way around.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I mean, and in turn, like we've talked about before, both reflects but also drives the vision that the university has of itself, and where that type of importance is placed, which I guess, is in turn a reflection of what's happening in the landscape anyway, right? So no, it's a fascinating conversation again about how much we've changed and how little we've changed, and how we are subject to change, and how in turn, we're maybe as institutions helping to drive that a little bit. So it would be we're going to look with interest about these publications that you're talking about, however bitter we may feel about them.
Yep.
But we will certainly read them with interest, and obviously encourage other colleagues to do so as well. This has been fantastic. A kind of a catch up as us as individuals, but a catch up for further understanding and reflection on where we're going as a, well, to use the word that Judith and I have been playing within last book, community a lot, right? Within international higher education. So yeah, it's positive, right? It's however we've got here, and however bad it may have been that's caused us to create these decisions. What you're outlining is they're all positive directions in terms of where the focus is and the energy. So Yeah, that's good. We've solved this then. That's another great podcast.
Yeah, I'm not sure about solving it, but
Oh, for a given
I'm
value
enjoy-
of solved. Yeah. No. We just gloss over this and move on to the next one. Yeah. Wait, don't worry about the details, Vicky. No.
Well, yeah, thank you for having me.
No, our pleasure. Judith, last word for you.
Yeah, no, just to say thank you so much again, Vicky. We could, as ever, talk to you for hours and hours, but I think you've really highlighted some key important aspects for us to think about and reflect on, and institutions to think on and reflect on as we go forward with our international strategies, and in I think a very positive way, actually, in many ways. This will, I think, bring institutions and those people within the institutions, all of them, together to help create a positive landscape for the future, and that can't be a bad thing. So thank you so much, Vicky. It's been a pleasure.
Likewise, thank you.